They said she won't get a thing, but let her fix the place first, and laughed. I spent $6,000 and 3 weeks renovating that house, then handed their own lies over to the judge. The cardboard box slipped from my fingers, Grandma's treasured photographs scattering like scattered memories across the weathered porch. And that's when my cousin Bryce, with a chilling smirk, told me this house, my grandma's house, was no longer mine. It was his. Can you even imagine? That was just the beginning of a gut-wrenching betrayal that shook my entire world. For 3 weeks, I had poured every ounce of my vacation, my energy, my very soul into restoring this old farmhouse. My fingers were raw from stripping layers of wallpaper, my back ached from moving furniture, and every evening I fell asleep dreaming of the original oak shining through years of grime. This place? It wasn't just wood and plaster, it was Grandma Eleanor. Her laugh echoed in these halls, her stories whispered from every creaking floorboard. So when Bryce stood there, a stranger holding a new key, and just casually said, "You can't be here anymore. This is my house now. I have the deed," my brain just stopped. I just blinked, certain I'd misheard him. "What are you talking about?" The question came out thin, barely audible above the autumn breeze rustling through the maple trees Grandma had planted the day I was born. Bryce just sighed, like I was the unreasonable one, like I was a child refusing bedtime. "The property transfer happened months ago, Sorrel. Everyone knows that." Everyone, apparently, except for me. My mind reeled back to the family dinner after the funeral. Aunt Patricia, all warm honey and saccharine smiles, had squeezed my hand across the table. "Since you were closest to Grandma," she'd purred, "would you mind helping clear the house? We're all so busy, and you've always had such a special connection to the place." Everyone around that table, Uncle Richard, Aunt Patricia, even Rachel, and yes, even Bryce, they all nodded, smiling their agreement when I, the sentimental fool, volunteered to handle the cleanup alone. Not once did anyone mention the house no longer belonged to the family trust, as we'd all believed. Not once did anyone hint it now belonged solely to Bryce. "I don't understand." I straightened, my hands trembling as I gathered the scattered photographs. "I've been working here for 3 weeks. I've been cataloging family heirlooms, restoring the original fixtures, and we appreciate that," Bryce cut in, but believe me, he didn't sound appreciative at all. "But now it's time for the professionals to take over. The family decided it would be best if I handled things from here. You've done enough." The trembling in my hands just stopped. 3 weeks of painstaking labor flashed before my eyes. The kitchen cabinets I'd stripped and refinished back to their original oak luster, the antique light fixtures I'd carefully rewired, the heirloom quilts I'd cleaned and preserved. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my restoration journal, every expense, every single hour, meticulously documented. "I've invested over $6,000 of my own money in this house," I said, my voice finding a strength I didn't know I had. "I replaced the bathroom plumbing. I restored the original hardwood floors. I preserved every family photograph and document I could find." Bryce's expression didn't even flicker. "That was your choice," he said. My fingers fumbled for my phone, scrolling to Aunt Patricia's name. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice immediately cautious when she heard mine. "Sorrel, dear, I didn't mince words. Bryce says the house is his. He's changing the locks." A pause. Then, the words that hit me like a physical blow. "Oh, honey. We just thought it would be easier to just let Bryce handle it after you cleaned up." "You knew." My voice cracked. "All of you knew when you asked me to spend my vacation clearing out the house?" "Sorrel, try to understand. Bryce has such good plans for the property, and you were always so attached to all those old things. We thought." I hung up before she could finish. The autumn sun slanted across the porch, the very spot where I'd spent countless afternoons with Grandma Eleanor, shelling peas and listening to her stories. My entire savings account emptied into a house that was secretly given away. My vacation time, spent honoring a grandmother whose memory my own family had weaponized against me. The betrayal burned cold and sharp in my chest as I looked up at Bryce, still waiting in the doorway that should have welcomed me home. They knew I would say yes. They knew I would pour my heart into preserving Grandma's legacy. They counted on it. And they used me anyway. 2 days later, the county courthouse loomed before me. Red brick and white columns that once seemed dignified now appeared imposing. Inside, the records clerk eyed me with bored indifference as I requested the property transfer documents for Grandma Eleanor's farmhouse. Transfer was finalized 6 months ago, she said, sliding a manila folder across the counter. Pretty straightforward case. My fingers trembled as I opened the folder. There it was, Grandma's signature, wavering but legible, transferring full ownership to Bryce Flint. The date stamps mocked me. The 12th of February, exactly 6 months before she passed away. The room tilted slightly as I scanned the additional notation at the bottom. Transfer pursuant to family agreement. Family agreement. The words burned into my retinas. I stumbled outside, collapsing onto the courthouse steps, the morning sunlight doing little to warm the chills spreading through my body. Nausea rose in waves as the pieces clicked together. The family dinners I wasn't invited to, the hushed phone calls that stopped when I entered rooms. Aunt Patricia's perfectly calculated request for me to help clear the house. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Winters, Grandma's neighbor. Contractors just arrived at Eleanor's house. They're measuring the rooms and talking about gutting the kitchen. Is that right? I scrolled through Bryce's social media. There it was, exactly what I'd feared. Plans for Maple Creek Farms Day, complete with modernized interiors and booking information. The historical farmhouse Grandma had lovingly maintained for 50 years, reduced to an Airbnb investment opportunity. My stomach lurched. They weren't just erasing Grandma, they were erasing us. Uncle Richard's house sat on a hillside overlooking the valley, its manicured lawn a testament to his successful accounting practice. I parked my rusted Honda beside Aunt Patricia's gleaming SUV and Rachel's compact car. The gang was all here. The living room felt less like a family gathering and more like a tribunal. Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia occupied the leather sofa, while Rachel perched uncomfortably on an ottoman, eyes fixed on the carpet. I remained standing, surrounded by framed family photographs, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations, reunions, none containing my face. This wasn't personal, Sorrel, Uncle Richard said, leaning forward with practiced composure, a fake sincerity in his voice. It was practical financial planning. Practical. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Tricking me into spending 3 weeks and $6,000 restoring a house you'd already given away? Uncle Richard sighed, exasperated. Eleanor needed convincing, but she eventually understood Bryce could make better use of the property. The tax implications alone. When did you decide? I interrupted, cutting him off. When did you all agree to keep me in the dark? Aunt Patricia fidgeted with her pearl necklace. Sorrel, dear, you've always been so good with old things, so sentimental. We knew you'd want everything preserved exactly as it was. While Bryce has vision, Uncle Richard added, cutting in, investment opportunity, future thinking. Rachel still wouldn't meet my eyes, her shoulders hunched. So I'm the family fool? I asked, the silence that followed answering more clearly than words ever could. The sentimental idiot who would work for free while Bryce prepared to profit? Uncle Richard's jaw tightened. He needs the investment opportunity. You just want it for sentimental reasons. The truth landed like a slap. They'd assessed our respective needs and judged mine worthless. Uncle Richard pulled out a folder, identical to the one from the courthouse. Bryce has contractors scheduled next week. They'll be clearing out the remaining items. Those items include family heirlooms I've cataloged, I said. Grandmother's quilts. Great-grandfather's handcrafted furniture. Letters from the 1800s. Worthless junk, Uncle Richard dismissed with a wave of his hand. Bryce needs a clean slate. Aunt Patricia attempted her honey voice again. Perhaps you'd like to choose 1 or 2 mementos? I spent 3 weeks preserving our history, I snapped, my voice rising. I exhausted my savings restoring what Grandma loved. Your choice, Uncle Richard said, shrugging, completely unapologetic. And now I need to make something very clear. You'll be trespassing if you go back to the property. The implications rippled through me. No legal recourse. No way to recover my costs. The library expected me back Monday, my vacation time depleted. The last physical connection to Grandma Eleanor would be bulldozed into modern neutrality. Her garden paved for parking. Her hand-built bookshelves ripped out for floating shelves from a catalog. "Don't make this difficult, Sorrel," Uncle Richard's voice hardened. "The family has decided." I left without another word, walking past the family photos that now seemed to actively exclude me. Through the front door nobody bothered to hold open. The evening air smelled like coming rain as I slid into my car, hands shaking too badly to insert the key. Then I remembered. The box of Grandma's journals I'd rescued from the water-damaged corner of the attic. The leather-bound books chronicling 60 years of her life, tucked safely in my apartment because I'd planned to preserve them properly before returning them to the family collection. The collection that would now be discarded as worthless junk. As I drove home that night, clutching Grandma's journals to my chest at every stoplight, I faced an impossible choice. Should I accept that the house was gone and preserve what little I had saved, or should I fight a battle against my entire family that I might not win? When family betrays you for money, is walking away sometimes the wiser path than standing your ground? The journals felt warm against my heart, as if Grandma's voice might rise from their pages with the answer. That same night, the smartphone screen glowed in the darkness of my apartment. Bryce's post, illuminated like a knife to the heart, making progress on my new investment property. Captioned beneath photos of sledgehammers smashing through the kitchen cabinets I'd spent 3 days restoring. The oak panels Grandma Eleanor had lovingly oiled every spring now splintered into a heap on her checkerboard floor. My thumb hovered over the comment button. I shouldn't, but the words typed themselves. Those cabinets were original to the house. They survived a century until today. The response came within minutes, not from Bryce, but from a law firm. The cease and desist letter appeared in my email with clinical precision, warning against continued harassment and defamatory statements regarding Mr. Flint's legally obtained property. My phone rang before I finished reading. Uncle Richard's name flashed on the screen. "Sorrel, this has gone far enough," he said without greeting. "The family is concerned about your behavior." My behavior? The words caught in my throat. "Bryce is demolishing Grandma's kitchen." "It's his kitchen now," Uncle Richard said, his voice taking on the practiced patience he used with difficult clients. "We've discussed this as a family. Your attachment to the house isn't healthy." "You mean you've discussed it without me?" I shot back. "Several people have called me, concerned about your comments online. You need to let this go, for everyone's sake." After he hung up, 3 more calls came in succession. Aunt Patricia, Cousin Dave, even my mother's cousin Lynette, who I hadn't spoken to in years. Each conversation followed the same infuriating script. "Richard says you're causing drama." It was just a misunderstanding. Think about what this is doing to the family. When the screen lit up with an estate sale announcement for Saturday, antique furniture and collectibles. Everything must go. I threw the phone across the room. The morning brought no relief. I called in sick to the library, knowing I couldn't face the gentle inquiries from coworkers. Instead, I spread Grandma's journals across my apartment floor, 16 leather-bound volumes spanning decades. The spines cracked reluctantly as if protecting their secrets. Sleep became an afterthought. Coffee mugs multiplied around me, leaving sepia rings on my hastily scrawled notes. I created a timeline on craft paper taped to my living room wall. Every family event, every house renovation, every mention of who visited and who didn't. By Tuesday, my eyes burned from strain and lack of sleep. The library called. My supervisor's voice carried a concern I felt I didn't deserve. "Sorrel, we need you back tomorrow. I understand you're going through something, but we can't cover your shifts indefinitely." I glanced at my bank balance, already depleted from the house repairs. A part-time archivist's salary barely covers rent, let alone legal consultation. The attorney I called yesterday quoted a retainer that might as well have been $1 million. "I'll be there, I promised," though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. A pattern emerged from the journals. March entries from 3 years ago. "Asked Richard to drive me to Dr. Simmons. He's too busy." April. Patricia promised to help with spring cleaning but canceled again. May. Called Bryce about fixing the porch step. He hasn't called back. And then always this. Sorrel came today. She brought those almond cookies I like. The isolation of it stung worse than the betrayal. While I visited every week, driving the 45 minutes each way between shifts, the family who now claimed such concern had left Grandma to manage alone. Wednesday night, I found it. Pressed between journal pages describing her garden plans, a dried lilac flower, its color faded to the palest lavender. A note in Grandma's careful script beneath it, from the bush sorrel and I planted when she was 10. She's the only one who remembers its story. The tears came then, for the first time since Bryce changed the locks. 2 days later, the morning sunlight illuminated Aunt Patricia's garden as I walked up her driveway unannounced. The irises along her fence had come from Grandma's garden years ago, divided and replanted. Their genetics identical to the ones now likely trampled under contractors' boots. Aunt Patricia looked up from her weeding, her smile faltering when she saw the journal in my hands. "Sorrel, what a surprise. I was just about to call you." "No, you weren't," I said, the words coming out steadier than I expected. "But I'm here anyway." Her gloved hands fidgeted with the trowel. "Honey, I know you're upset, but the house is just a building. You need to move on." "It's not just a building," I said, stepping closer, feeling my spine straighten. "It's her life story, and all of ours too." I opened the journal, finding the marked page. "Bryce visited today," I read aloud. "First time in 2 years. All he talked about was what the property might be worth if I sold it. I don't think Bryce has ever looked past the walls. He sees money. Sorrel sees memory." Aunt Patricia's face changed as I turned to another flagged page. "Richard and Patricia came for Christmas dinner. They brought a man from the bank. They think I don't notice how they whisper when I leave the room. They don't realize how quiet this house becomes when everyone leaves. How it echoes with all the people who aren't here anymore." I paused, my voice breaking slightly. "They end vacation. Sorrel called to check if I needed anything from town. She's the only one who asks. The others just tell me what I should do." Aunt Patricia's face had lost its carefully maintained composure. She reached for the garden fence to steady herself. "I didn't know she felt abandoned," she whispered. "You never asked." The realization hit me suddenly. I wasn't just fighting for ownership. I was fighting for the preservation of what the house represented. For the stories that would otherwise be hauled away with the furniture Bryce deemed worthless. The next morning, Mrs. Winters appeared at my apartment door. Grandma's neighbor of 40 years stood ramrod straight despite her 86 years, a manila envelope clutched in her veined hands. "I've written down everything," she announced, pressing the envelope into my hands. "How you shoveled Eleanor's walk every snowfall. How you drove her to every doctor's appointment last year. How she told me she wanted you to have her grandmother's china cabinet because you were the only one who knew where it came from. My supervisor called that afternoon. 'I have someone you should meet,' she said. 'A friend from law school who works with a pro bono group specializing in elder law. They're interested in your grandmother's case.' For the first time in weeks, hope flickered. Where my family valued property and investment opportunities, these strangers valued history and relationships. They strengthened my resolve to honor what remained unwritten in Grandma's will, but clear in her journals, her wish that her life's memories be preserved. That night, I compiled everything for a formal challenge to the title transfer. The journals documented Grandma's confusion during the period when she signed the papers. Mrs. Winters' testimony confirmed the pattern of neglect. My meticulous restoration log proved the investment I made in good faith. As I prepared to email the documents to the legal aid group, my phone chimed with a text from Rachel, who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the family drama. "I need to talk to you before the hearing. I know something about the day Grandma signed those papers." On confrontation day, the courthouse felt foreign yet familiar, like Grandma's house after Bryce gutted the kitchen. I stood at the podium, my restoration journal open before me, my voice steadier than my hands. "Your Honor, over 3 weeks I invested $6,000 and 200 hours restoring Eleanor Flint's historic farmhouse. I maintained unwavering eye contact with Judge Harmon, a man whose silver hair and weathered face reminded me of the farmers who used to visit Grandma's porch. I replaced period-accurate fixtures, preserved original hardwoods, and cataloged family artifacts dating back to 1892. I slid 8 before and after photographs across the bench. Each image told its own story. The kitchen cabinets restored to their original oak luster, the hand-painted dining room trim I'd spent 3 days carefully reviving. I undertook this work, believing I was honoring my grandmother's wishes and preserving our family legacy. My voice caught slightly. At no point was I informed the property had been transferred to my cousin 6 months prior. The judge examined my meticulously organized expense receipts, then glanced toward Bryce and Uncle Richard. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he studied the property transfer documents. "Miss Flint, these restoration costs are substantial for someone of your means, and this documentation is remarkably thorough." He tapped my grandmother's journal. "And these personal writings, they suggest your grandmother had specific intentions for the property's preservation?" Before I could respond, Bryce sprang to his feet, his expensive suit a stark contrast to my thrift store blazer. "She stole those journals from my property." His voice echoed through the courtroom. "Those are private family documents she removed without permission after the legal transfer." The outburst rippled through the small courtroom. From the corner of my eye, I spotted Rachel shifting uncomfortably in her seat behind Uncle Richard. "That's not true." The small voice came from the back of the courtroom. Rachel stood, her hands visibly trembling. "I was there when Grandma signed those papers." Rachel's voice strengthened as she stepped forward. Uncle Richard told her it was just financial planning to avoid probate taxes. Grandma kept asking if Sorrel would be okay with it. They told her Sorrel had agreed. Uncle Richard's face flushed crimson. "Rachel, this isn't the place." "Miss Flint, Rachel," the judge interrupted, looking at her sternly. "Are you willing to provide formal testimony about what you witnessed?" Rachel nodded, avoiding Uncle Richard's glare. "I think that would be appropriate." Judge Harmon turned to the court clerk. "Let's get Ms. Rachel Flint sworn in." As Rachel took the stand, Uncle Richard tugged at his collar. The carefully constructed narrative began crumbling around him as Rachel described how Grandma Eleanor had repeatedly asked about my approval before signing anything. When the testimony concluded, Judge Harmon removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ms. Sorrel Flint, given these allegations of misrepresentation, I need to ask, do you wish to pursue complete nullification of the property transfer, or would you consider a compromise that preserves the historical elements of the home?" I hesitated, my breath catching. Would fighting for full ownership honor Grandma's memory better, or would finding a middle ground that preserved the house's legacy be more in line with her wishes? Before I could answer, Mrs. Winters, Grandma's neighbor of 40 years, approached the stand. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of the farmhouse's significance to our small community. That wraparound porch hosted the town's first civil rights meeting in 1963, she explained. "The Flint farmhouse isn't just a family home, it's a landmark of our shared history." My pro bono lawyer, a former library patron who'd volunteered after hearing my story, presented my documentation next. My client's educational background in archival science and historic preservation makes her uniquely qualified to maintain this property's historical integrity. Even my boss from the library testified about my professional dedication to preserving community history. In my 30 years as head librarian, I've never seen someone with such commitment to honoring the past while making it accessible to future generations. The judge nodded thoughtfully. The court recognizes a clear pattern of care and commitment on Ms. Sorrel Flint's part, which stands in stark contrast to what appears to be primarily investment interests. My lawyer introduced one final argument. "Your Honor, we believe this case also involves unjust enrichment. Mr. Bryce Flint has directly benefited from my client's substantial unpaid labor and personal financial investment, which has significantly increased the property's value." During the recess, Uncle Richard approached me in the hallway, his confident facade now replaced with nervous energy. "We should talk about settling this," he muttered. "There's no need to drag this out." Nearby, Aunt Patricia spoke with the court clerk. "I never knew all the details," she insisted. Richard handled the paperwork. The final blow came when Bryce's contractor took the stand, confirming that many of the historical elements I'd painstakingly preserved had already been removed or destroyed. The original banister was torn out Tuesday, he admitted, and the built-in china cabinet from the dining room is sitting in a dumpster behind the property. As the day's testimony concluded, Judge Harmon tapped his gavel. I'll render my decision after reviewing all documentation, including Mrs. Eleanor Flint's journals. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. I gathered my papers, the weight of Grandma's journals heavy in my hands. For the first time since this began, I felt something beyond betrayal, something that felt surprisingly like hope. The next day, the courthouse steps felt cold beneath me as Uncle Richard approached, his shoes clicking with each deliberate step. Aunt Patricia hovered behind him, her fingers twisting her pearl necklace. Bryce stood slightly apart, arms crossed over his chest, jaw clenched. Sorrel, Uncle Richard's smile stretched too thin across his face. We should talk before we go back in there. I clutched my folder of documents closer. Days and nights of restoration journals, expense receipts, and before and after photographs pressed against my ribs like armor. The family has discussed things, he continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. We think we can find a compromise that keeps our private matters private. Aunt Patricia nodded quickly. Family unity is what your grandmother would have wanted, not this public embarrassment. Public embarrassment, I repeated, tasting the words. Is that what you call the truth? Uncle Richard's eyes narrowed. Consider your professional reputation, Sorrel. The library board includes several of my golf partners. Small towns talk and being known as someone who attacks her own family over property. Over lies, I corrected him, my voice steadier than my hands had ever been. Bryce stepped forward, pulling a folded check from his pocket. $2,000. That's fair compensation for your time. Take it, and drop this nonsense. The amount hit me like a slap. $2,000. Less than a third of what I'd spent restoring floors he planned to tear out, plumbing he'd ripped from the walls, fixtures I polished by hand. That's your idea of fair? The folder in my arm suddenly felt heavier with purpose. The bailiff called us back inside before anyone could answer. The courtroom would gleamed under fluorescent lights as I approached the stand. Judge Harmon's eyes followed me, assessing. His silver hair caught the light as he leaned forward. Miss Flint, I understand you wish to present additional evidence? My voice found its strength in the quiet room. Yes, Your Honor. One by one, I placed my exhibits on the table. The leather-bound restoration journal with dated entries and photographs. The stack of receipts, each one highlighting materials purchased with my savings. The contractor quotes showing what professional restoration would have cost. The wall of evidence grew, physical proof of every hour and dollar I invested, believing I was preserving family history. And this, I said, placing my grandmother's journal gently atop the stack, contains entries from the last year of my grandmother's life. I opened to a marked page and read her words aloud, the 15th of September. Sorrel spent the weekend helping me organize the attic. She understands why these things matter. The stories they tell. When I'm gone, she's the one who should preserve this place. Not to sell it, but to keep our history alive. The courtroom remained silent as I closed the journal. Your Honor, my pro bono attorney said, rising to stand beside me, we've documented the extensive work my client performed under false pretenses. We're asking the court to consider co-stewardship based on sweat equity and the deceased's clearly documented intentions. I stepped forward. This isn't about ownership. It's about honoring a life and preserving our history. The attorney placed a folder before the judge. We're proposing historical designation for the property with shared family access. My client doesn't seek to exclude her family from the house, only to ensure its preservation. Judge Harmon studied me over his reading glasses, his expression thoughtful. An unusual proposal, Miss Flint. Most people in your position would simply seek full ownership. The house deserves better than being a prize in a family fight, I answered. My grandmother believed that. So do I. 2 days later, we gathered again. The courtroom was fuller now. Mrs. Winters sat in the front row alongside my boss from the library and several neighbors I recognized from my grandmother's street. Word had spread about our family's private war. Judge Harmon cleared his throat, silencing the murmurs. In the matter of the Flint property transfer, I've reviewed all submitted evidence and testimony. He looked directly at Bryce. While I find the transfer legally executed, I also find compelling evidence of unjust enrichment and moral obligation. Uncle Richard shifted in his seat. The property will remain under Mr. Bryce Flint's name, the judge continued, and my heart sank for a split second, then steadied as he continued. But with conditions. First, Mr. Flint must reimburse Ms. Sorrel Flint for all documented expenses related to the property's restoration, totaling $6,743. Bryce's face reddened. Second, the court grants co-stewardship rights to Ms. Flint for purposes of historical preservation and documentation. Any structural modifications to the property must be approved by both parties for a period of 5 years. The judge leaned forward, removing his glasses. This house represents significant family history, Mr. Flint. Your grandmother's journals make clear her intentions regarding preservation. While she may have signed the property to you, the court finds a clear moral obligation to honor the spirit of her wishes. As we rose, a woman approached with a notepad. Millbrook Gazette, she said, smiling. I'd love to interview you about saving your grandmother's historic farmhouse. Our readers appreciate these stories of preservation. Bryce pushed past us, face flushed with humiliation. Uncle Richard hurried after him while Aunt Patricia stood frozen, uncertain which direction to choose. Later, as people filtered out of the courthouse, Bryce caught my arm in the hallway. This arrangement won't work, he said, his voice tight with frustration. The restrictions, the media attention, it's not what I signed up for. You wanted an investment property, I reminded him. That's still what you have. I'm offering to sell my rights to you at a reduced rate. His words came fast, desperate. Take your precious museum. I'm done with this. The offer dangled between us. Everything I had fought for was suddenly within reach. But my bank account held barely enough for next month's rent after everything I'd spent. I can't afford to buy you out, I admitted. Figure it out, he said, releasing my arm. Because I'm not playing house curator for the next 5 years. That evening, I stood alone in the partially gutted kitchen. The original farmhouse sink I'd rescued from the barn and restored sat balanced on sawhorses, waiting for installation that may never happen. My fingertips traced the worn edges, feeling the ghostly imprints of my grandmother's hands washing decades of family dishes. The walls around me, half stripped, half preserved, told our story in layers of paint and paper. I pressed my palm against the oldest layer, exposed where Bryce's contractors had begun demolition. I didn't have the money to save this house. But somehow, I couldn't walk away from the only walls that remembered who we really were. The brass key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. 6 months after the courthouse battle, I pushed open the farmhouse door and breathed in the scent of beeswax polish and fresh paint. Light streamed through windows I'd spent weekends restoring, catching dust motes that danced above the refinished hardwood floors. Morning, Sorrel. Mrs. Winters called from the kitchen, where she was arranging wildflowers in Grandma Eleanor's cut-glass vase. Behind her, 3 volunteers from the Historical Society carefully hung framed photographs along the hallway. The school group arrives at 11. I reminded them, my voice carrying a confidence that still sometimes surprised me. No longer the woman who had dropped family photographs in shock on this very porch, I now moved through these rooms with purpose, pointing out original fixtures and sharing the stories embedded in every corner. The library board's decision last month still felt like a dream, a partial leave to develop what we're calling the Memory House as a community archive project. Every family deserves to have their history preserved, I'd told them during my presentation. Not just the wealthy or famous. In the kitchen, the same space where Bryce had planned to install granite countertops and tear out the hand-built cabinets, 20 folding chairs formed a semicircle. The worn oak table that had witnessed 4 generations of family meals now held pamphlets about our community preservation initiative. I smoothed my hand over its surface, feeling the slight depression where Grandma Eleanor rolled out pie crusts every Sunday. Is this where people will share their stories? Asked Deanna, one of the high school volunteers. This is exactly where people have always shared their stories, I answered, placing a vintage tape recorder at the center of the table. Now we're just making sure those stories get preserved. The front door creaked, and I turned to find Uncle Richard standing awkwardly in the hallway, a cardboard box clutched in his arms. "I found these in the attic," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Seemed like they belonged here. Inside the box, albums filled with photographs spanning 7 decades, each one meticulously labeled in Grandma's handwriting. "Thank you," I managed, the words coming easier than I expected. When he left, I joined the small gathering in the parlor. Mrs. Winters, the legal team that fought pro bono for our compromise, and 3 colleagues from the library who'd spent weekends stripping wallpaper and cataloging artifacts. "Look what I rescued," Rachel announced, pushing through the door with Grandma's maple rocking chair balanced awkwardly in her arms. Bryce had it in storage. I told him it was either coming back here or I was telling the newspaper about the missing journal pages. We placed it by the window where Grandma always sat, angling it to catch the afternoon light. Jennifer from the legal team raised her teacup. To Eleanor Flint, who knew houses remember who loved them. We drank to that, teacups clinking in the sunlight. Later, as the first school group filed through the front hall, their voices bright with curiosity, I stood on a stepladder and carefully mounted a brass plaque beside the door, in memory of Eleanor Flint. Because houses remember who love them. The grant funding had come through last week, making the Community Memory Library official. I scanned the faces of children settling cross-legged on the parlor floor for our first storytelling Saturday program. Before we began, I unfolded the letter Rachel finally gave me last month. "Thank you for fighting for something we didn't even know we were losing," she wrote in shaky handwriting. As I placed Grandma's teacup back on the windowsill where she always kept it, I wondered about the memories in your own life. Are there places or things that hold your family's stories? And if they were threatened, would you find the courage to stand up for them, even when standing alone?